Welcome, friends, to At Home with Theosophy. This is the third class in this series where we are exploring the book Life After Death by Annie Besant. We are looking at the first part of the book, which is about what happens after we die, immediately after we die, on the first plane of consciousness in which we find ourselves, that is on the astral plane. And that's what we are going to see today. This plane is called in Theosophical literature as Kama Loka. These are two Sanskrit words, Kama and Loka, as we are going to see, which can be translated, as you see there, as the desire land. So we will see what happens as we enter Kama Loka, which is as the place of our passions and desires. So Annie Besant says, Loka is a Sanskrit word that may be translated as place, world, land. In Theosophical literature, we normally call it plane, a plane of existence or consciousness. So that Kama Loka is literally the place or the world of desire. Kama being the name of that part of the human organism that includes all the passions, desires, and emotions which man has in common with the lower animals. This is something that is important to understand, the real meaning of Kama, because sometimes Kama is translated either as desire or as emotion, but it is a particular kind of desire or emotion. It is that kind of desire, passion, however we want to call it, that we have in common with the animal kingdom, because actually this mode of consciousness that we call desire was developed through evolution in the animal kingdom. Plants have not developed this aspect, although they have their own consciousness, their own sensitivity. But it is in the animal kingdom that the sense of desire is developed first. And then we inherit that principle and we add a mind. The addition of the mind many times makes the desire stronger, makes the desire unbalanced many times. A desire for something may be perfectly natural, but when the mind adds the memory of the pleasure derived, from that, and the planning on trying to repeat it as much as possible, then we have a situation that is not known in the animal kingdom. In the animal kingdom, desires are natural, and they have their own field of activity, and they don't go beyond that. That's not the case with human beings because we have the mind. So, for example, aggression in the animal normally happens just when there is a threat or when the animal has to hunt, etc. The animal doesn't plan on getting revenge or on some other animal that hurt him or her before. It doesn't have regret about the past, etc. And of course, we are talking about the whole animal kingdom, which is, there are many degrees of development in the animal kingdom. We have the higher animals, elephants, pets, etc., that they begin to awaken the principle of the mind. So they do have some more of a memory, etc. But the idea that is important for us is that Kama is all those desires that are connected to the body, to the separate personality, desires and emotions. When we talk about compassion, love, the desire for the spiritual, all of that is not really part of Kama. So that's important to keep in mind, because in Theosophical literature, you will find many times said that we have to get rid of the kamic elements. And some people may think that we need to get rid of emotions or desires, like the desire to help humanity, and that's not the case. So Annie Besant continues, in this division of the universe, this plane, the Kamaloka, dwell all the human entities that have shaken off the dense body and its ethereal double, but have not yet disentangled themselves from the passional and emotional nature. So as we are going to see, after we let go of the physical body and the ethereal counterpart, we find ourselves on this plane of desires with wearing, let's say, the emotional body or the desire body. And that also will be transcended. And then we move on to a deeper aspect of the cosmos and ourselves, or a higher aspect, however we want to put it, as a diagram. That is what most religions call heaven, but that's something that we are going to explore in our next series. The existence of such regions, both the Kamaloka and the region that follows, is postulated by the esoteric philosophy and is known to the adepts, but also to very many less highly evolved men and women by personal experience. All that is needed for the study of these regions is the evolution of the faculties latent in every man. A living man, in ordinary parlance, can leave his dense and ethereal bodies behind him and explore these regions without going through death's gateway. In this way, those regions become to him matters of knowledge, definite and certain. So this is another important point that Besant is making. We talked about this to some extent in our previous class. It is possible for us human beings to visit and to explore these planes in which people who have passed are having their existence. And what Annie Besant says here is, to a large extent, part of her own experience. She had developed these latent faculties in herself, as she says, and she studied all this. In her book, she says it's like a person going to Africa and going to the deserts and exploring and learning about them. And then when the person comes back, that person has a knowledge of the place. Well, it is the same in exploring all these inner planes. Sometimes people, when talking about life after death, they say, well, nobody came back to tell us what happens there. That's not technically true. There are many instances of people who say things through mediums or channels, etc. But perhaps more importantly, there are people who claim to be able to research into all of this. These people are like the scientists, let's say, of those hidden realms that most people in humanity cannot access. And just as we take what scientists say about the world of bacteria and viruses, even if we have never seen one, if we are not a scientist or a microbiologist or biologist, we take what those scientists say. Similarly, all these teachings that we have in the Theosophical tradition and the origin of the teachings in any serious religious movement come from people who claimed the ability to research all this by direct perception. Now, just as in science, you may have a, let's call them seer, you may have a bad scientist, a very inexperienced one, perhaps a not very intelligent one, to be able to understand what he or she is seeing through the microscope, or you may have a brilliant one. So similarly, with any research on the inner planes, you may have some people who are brilliant in their ability to perceive correctly, to understand, in their depth of perception, how much they can see, in their ability not to let their own prejudices cloud what they are watching, they are observing. And you may have people who are not very good at that. Normally, in the Theosophical tradition, it is said that just as a scientist requires a training, and a quite thorough training, similarly, a seer requires a thorough training. There are people who are born with certain capacities for clairvoyance, or to project their astral bodies. And as we said, the astral plane is the plane of Kamaloka, as we are going to see. And these people may bring the result of their observation. If people are not trained, part of those observations may be correctly interpreted, and other parts may be incorrectly interpreted. Also, the astral plane is a world in itself. So many people have access only to a small part of the world. It's like going to a continent again and landing maybe in a city or in a forest or in a desert, and describing that as if it was the whole of the continent. Well, some seers have the ability to travel throughout the whole of the plane. So this is a very complex research. The research on the inner planes is far more complex than the research that scientists develop on the physical plane. And we have relatively few trained people throughout history that have been able to do this kind of research. So, of course, the amount of information we have, the possibility of comparing the perception from different seers, all that is far less on the inner planes than what we have from the information that we get from scientists. Nevertheless, there are some seers that have been highly effective, and if you, after studying their work, you trust what they say, if to some extent you have seen either the logic of what they express, or you have been able to verify some of those teachings, then you can trust that what they say is close to truth. Annie Besant, Blavatsky, Leadbeater, these are all theosophists that have done this kind of research. They all said, just like no scientist is infallible, this is the same. We are, and this is many times when we think of research in the spiritual realm, we have the tendency to take this as a divine revelation that has to be taken 100% true. This comes from God or from some infallible source. And Theosophists say that is not the case. Actually, all of this is a kind of research, and depends on the limitations of the researcher, of the seer. So in the Theosophical tradition, all this is presented without a declaration of dogma or authority. So what we are reading here is the result of Besant's experience, along with the experience of some other theosophists that she could compare experiences with. So she continues, Kamaloka is a region peopled by intelligent and semi-intelligent entities, just as our own is thus peopled. It is crowded, like our world, with many types and forms of living things, as diverse from each other as a blade of grass is different from a tiger from a man. This is another important point about the astral plane or the region of Kamaloka. People tend to think that there is only one or two kinds of entities there. Maybe there are angels and people who have passed, or gods, and that's all there is there. And as I mentioned, the astral plane is a world in itself. There are many kingdoms of many different entities. Some of them are very intelligent, some of them are not. Some of them are very dangerous, some of them are not. Some of them have gone through the human stage of evolution, some of them are not. It is a very diverse plane, and many of these entities may, in one way or the other, communicate with the physical plane. So we can't really take for granted that the entity that is communicating with the physical plane is one or the other. This is a very complex subject we cannot go into, but there may be all kinds of entities communicating with the physical plane. Many of them just tend to impersonate whatever they see that is important emotionally for the person that is either receiving the messages or communicating, however that happens. And many times that impersonation is not true. It's just that these entities on the astral plane know how to appear so that we open our doors to them. So this is a very complex science, let's say, that is the reason why we need to be trained by somebody that has a full knowledge of this world. If we are, if we have psychic sensitivity to be, for our perceptions to be reliable. She continues, Kamaloka interpenetrates our own world and is interpenetrated by it. So right now, right here, Kamaloka is around us, as also the higher planes. But as the states of matter in the two worlds differ, they coexist without the knowledge of the intelligent beings in either. Only under abnormal circumstances can consciousness of each other's presence arise among the inhabitants of the two worlds. So just as there are many different kinds of waves right now in this place, different radio waves or electromagnetic waves coming from the light, or sound waves, etc. All of them are mixed here without interfering with each other. Similarly, there are all these worlds interpenetrating each other, but they are actually separated because they are made of different matter, let's say, as Annie Besant puts it there. So normally we are not aware, like right next to us, there may be a person in Kamaloka or a person in Devachan, the next stage in heaven. It may be right next to us. But we are not aware of that because we are on a different plane of consciousness, perceiving what we call physical matter and not perceiving the astral matter or the Devachanic matter. So having more or less very briefly explained the idea of the astral plane or Kamaloka, Annie Besant continues and says, from this necessary digression, we return to a person in whom the dense body and etheric double is already disposed, because that person died, as we explored before. So consciousness left behind both the dense body and the ethereal one. So prana is the next principle. It's the portion of the life energy appropriated by the man in his embodied state. Having lost its vehicle, the ethereal double, which has slipped away from its controlling energy, now prana must pass back into the great life reservoir of the universe. So the idea that prana, the principle of life, the vitality, there is the universal life around us, and we appropriate one portion of it while we are alive. The etheric double does this. It takes a portion of the universal prana and applies it to maintain our physical body. After the physical body dies and the etheric double also dissolves, then the prana that was kept there goes back to its universal source, the universal life. So what is left, if you see, we have used this chart before, we have the lowest principle is the physical body, which Besant calls it the dense body, because technically speaking, the ethereal body or the etheric body is still part of the physical body. It's like a subtler aspect of physical matter. But just to not go into that subtlety, let's call the dense body the physical body, which dies. Then the etheric body begins to dissolve, and along with it, prana goes back to its repository. And then consciousness is at the level of the kamic principle, the desire principle, the body that now, having lost the two lower bodies, the body that we have now to exist, to perceive, is the body of desire. It is called kama rupa. Rupa means form. So now we are aware in the body of desires, the kama rupa. So the man who is clothed with the kama rupa, the man is now clothed with the kama rupa, a body of astral matter. This desire body undergoes a marked change soon after death, because we have a desire body while we are alive. Sometimes it's called the astral body or the emotional body. But after death, that emotional body, that desire body, undergoes a change that Annie Besant is going to describe. She says, and remember, before we continue, the astral matter, there are 7 types of astral matter, or 7 states of the astral matter. Just as in our physical body, we have a solid aspect, we have liquids, and we have gases, in our lungs, etc. Similarly, there are different states of astral matter, which in our emotional body, when we are alive, they are all mixed, all interpenetrating each other. Now, in the case of the astral body, these different kinds of matter are also our senses. We perceive the astral plane through the different kinds of astral matter. And we will see why this is important. So she says the different densities of the astral matter, of which the desired body is composed, after death arrange themselves in a series of shells or envelopes, the densest being outside, shutting the consciousness away from all but very limited contact and expression. So we perceive through the astral matter. If all the different states of astral matter arrange themselves in layers, that means that we can perceive only whatever kind of matter is in the surface of our desired body after death. So if the densest part of matter is outside, then we can only perceive the densest desires and emotions. In a certain sense, it is like, as I said, like if all these layers were different senses. So it's like if after death, first we only have the sense of touch. Then that layer dissolves, and now we have the next sense available there, let's say the sense of hearing. And then that layer dissolves, and then we have the sense of smelling, etc. So in this kind of cocoon that happens, the consciousness inside can only perceive, as I said, whatever matter is in the surface. If the person had a lot of the densest matter in his or her astral body, then that person may be aware of the densest kinds of emotions. The idea is that all these different types of astral matter are in tune with different types of emotions. The densest the matter is, the more materialistic or aggressive or selfish the kind of emotion. So the higher kinds of astral matter are more connected to love and spirituality, etc. So now consciousness is within this cocoon and can only perceive of the astral body, of the astral plane, that which the particular astral body will allow. Now, normally, as Annie Besant is going to explain, when this rearrangement happens, consciousness turns upon itself. So Annie Besant says, consciousness turns in on itself if left undisturbed and prepares itself for the next step onwards, while the desired body gradually disintegrates shell after shell. So this rearrangement cuts consciousness off at the beginning. And in an ideal situation, that consciousness stays within the astral body, semi-conscious, and as all these layers dissolve little by little. When all those layers dissolve and there is no more an astral body, then consciousness awakens in the next higher body. Now, the physical was dissolved, the ethereal was dissolved, the astral body or desired body was dissolved, and now consciousness is awakened on the next higher body, that is the mental body, which has its plane on what we call Devachan or heaven, etc. And that mental body is not just a body of thoughts, it's the body also of all the higher emotions and spiritual aspirations, etc. So normally, the idea is that consciousness goes through the astral plane without being very aware, because the Kamaloka is like the purgatory. It's not the highest experience after death. It's an intermediate sphere, as we are going to see. So up to the point of this rearrangement in shells of the matter of the desired body, the post-mortem experience of all people is much the same. It is a dreamy, peaceful semi-consciousness, as before said. But at this point, different possibilities arise. So once the astral body arranges itself in layers, there are different possibilities for what kind of experience the person is going to have. So she says, let us trace a normal, uninterrupted progression in Kamaloka up to the threshold of Devachan, the heavenly experience, and then we can return to consider other classes of circumstances. So she says, take a person who has led a pure life and has striven to rise and to identify himself with the higher rather than the lower part of his nature. So a person that has a spiritual aspiration or religious aspiration, that tries to be a good person, that tries not to let himself or herself be driven by desires, etc. This kind of person. Besant says, after shaking off the dense body and the etheric double, and after prana has remingled with the ocean of life, he is clothed only with the Kamarupa, as we have seen. This is just a summary. The mind, woven with the passions, emotions, and desires during life, has purified them and has assimilated their pure part, absorbed it into itself. So during life, as we try to lead a spiritual life, the mind assimilates all the higher emotions and higher desires, the spiritual aspect. This is what I just mentioned, that when the desired body is dissolved, we are left in the mental body, but a mental body that has also all the higher emotions in it. So the passional elements in that person being but weak and accustomed to comparatively little activity, will not be able to assert themselves strongly in kama loka. All that is left of kama, of desire, is a mere residue, easily gotten rid of, from which the immortal triad, our true nature, can readily free itself. So because this person does not live in and by desire, of course, it doesn't mean that that person didn't have desires during life, but desire was not the main thing in their lives. You know, we talked about this. Some people live for the bodily experiences, and the highlight of their lives and the aim of their work, and it's just to have bodily experiences. We are talking here about a person whose interests are beyond that. Of course, that person still may have this or that desire, but they are not the center of their lives. So because desire was not such a big factor in their lives, when we are in kama loka, or they are in kama loka, then that desire is not strong enough to wake up our consciousness. Just like in our daily life, the desire may not be strong enough to make us, you know, go and rob a place. You know, I really desire that. I don't have the money, and my desire forces me to go and to, you know, steal it. Because we are talking about a person in whom the desire doesn't have that strength to drag consciousness in that way, something similar happens after death. The desire that is left is not strong enough to awaken consciousness and to drag consciousness to try to satisfy those desires. So Annie Besant says, slowly the immortal triad, our higher nature, the true man, and remember when Annie Besant uses man here, she's using it in general for the true in us. Man comes from the Sanskrit root from which the word manu comes. Manu is a Sanskrit word that means the thinker. And man in English comes from the same Sanskrit root as manu. So in theosophical literature, frequently the word man is not used for the male person. It's used for the evolutionary stage in which the divine spark is developing the ability to think, the thinker, the stage of evolution where we think. That is a man. And in theosophical literature, whenever there is any entity in the universe that has the ability to think, that person is, you know, a human or man, which is the original term of this, or as the original meaning of this term. It wasn't originally meant to refer to male or female. Later on, we associated it only to the male. So just keep that in mind. All this was written in the 19th century or early 20th. So slowly the immortal triad in us draws in all his forces. He draws into himself the memories of the earth life just ended, its loves, hopes, aspirations, and prepares to pass out of Kamaloka, out of the desire world, into the blissful rest of Devachan, the abode of the gods. That's a literal translation. Deva is the gods, Chan is a place, or as some say, the land of bliss. So in a spiritual person, Kamaloka, we go through it quite unconscious, kind of asleep, with, you know, nice dreams, and we wake up in the heavenly state, the land of bliss, the abode of the gods. So Kamaloka is just an intermediate period where we just have to wait until the emotional body is disintegrated, And depending on how strong the desires were, that emotional body or desire of body or body of desire will take longer or shorter to be completely disintegrated. In very pure people, this may last only a few hours. Uh, in people who are completely identified with their desires, they may stay on the astral plane for even thousands of years. So we will see a little of this. So the Kamaloka is just this intermediate state in which we purify ourselves of the desire nature before we can be awakened in the pure land of bliss. So this is what she says. The type of man we are considering passes through this in the peaceful, dreamy state already described, and if left undisturbed, will not regain full consciousness until these stages are passed through. Thus, in the happiest cases, consciousness passes without vivid awakening into the deeper pre-devachanic unconsciousness, and peace gives way to the blissful awakening in Devachan, heaven, for the period of repose that intervenes between two incarnations. So there is this dreamy consciousness. There is what is called a second death, where when the astral body is about to be completely dissolved and our consciousness is losing that body, then we fall again unconscious, as we did after the death of the physical body. So we fall into unconsciousness, and then we wake up to full consciousness in the land of bliss. So that is the path of a spiritual person in normal circumstances. And then most of our time between two incarnations is in this land of peace or bliss. So she says, but during the whole period that the five principles, the immortal triad, which is our higher nature, plus the mind and plus the desire, the body of desire, during all the period that this remains in Kamaloka, whether the period be long or short, days or centuries, they are within the reach of earth influences. So once we are in the land of bliss, we cannot be called back, our attention cannot be called back to the physical plane. There is like a gap, like a chasm between, because we don't have an astral body, so the communication, we don't have physical body, we don't have astral body, so when we are in Devachan, our attention cannot be called back to the physical plane. People can visit us and become aware of us, people who are living, because all the living people have a mental body, and the departed now is in his or her mental body. So if we raise our consciousness to the mental plane, we can communicate with the dead person. But we have to go there. We cannot call the attention of the dead people back here. But while a person is on Kamaloka, because this is a plane that is immediately next to the physical, the attention of that person the consciousness can be woken up, and the attention can be brought back to the physical. Now, this is not a good idea from the Theosophical point of view. An awakening may be caused by the passionate sorrow and desires of friends left on earth, and these violently vibrating kamic elements in the embodied persons. Besant doesn't want to say in the living person and the dead person, because that's really a misnomer. We are all living, but living on different planes. So she prefers embodied person and disembodied person. So the passionate sorrow and the desires and the inability to let go and the strong this is when emotions are strong, the strong wish to retain the person. All these things produce on the emotional plane, the astral plane, strong vibrations directed to the person that passed, that all those vibrations are like knocking at the door very strongly. And these vibrations may wake up the consciousness that was in this, dreamy, pleasant state. It may wake up that consciousness to the fact that that person is dead, that there are people on the physical plane that, are suffering, etc. So she says, the violently vibrating kamic elements in the embodied persons may set up vibrations in the desired body of the disembodied, and so reach and rouse the lower mind from its dreamy state to vivid remembrance of the earth life left. This awakening is often accompanied with acute suffering, and even if this be avoided, the natural process of the triad, the higher nature, freeing itself from the lower nature, is rudely disturbed, and the completion of its freedom is delayed. So waking up consciousness in this way, as Besant says, is a cause of suffering in general, of distress. Now the person may not be able to let go for a while of the idea. The falling asleep on the astral plane is a protection from nature. A mother that died and left perhaps her children orphans, that person cannot be happy knowing that the children are orphans. In order to avoid this suffering, nature generates this kind of protection so that the person is unconscious on the astral plane until that person awakens on the devachanic plane in heaven, and that person now is aware only of the souls of her children, which are eternal, which are always blissful, etc. That person is not going to be aware of the physical personality of her children. We will see all this in our next series. Still, the love that the mother has for the children go down to the physical and can help the children, etc. But on the devachanic plane, there is no room for sorrow. There is no room for worry. There is no room for anything, because we are connected to the true self of everybody, people who are alive and people who have died, before us, but that we love. So we can connect with the souls of people. Now, while we are on the astral plane, that's not the case. So if we are awakened on the astral plane for these reasons, then we may become aware of all the suffering that is there, and there is very little we can do. And that is a source of distress and worry for many people, until little by little people learn to accept that there is very little they can do and that they should not try to intervene on the physical plane. Some people may be dragged to try to intervene on the physical plane, and that is not good at all for them. So in the Theosophical view, this is quite unfortunate when this happens. In the best cases, that person will suffer, and as Annie Besant says, the process will be interrupted until the person realizes that he or she has to keep moving on, and then falls back into that dreamy consciousness before waking up in the land of bliss. So she continues, intense desire may move the disembodied entity to so that's one of the options. The second option is if the person that died with an intense desire, either intense attachment to the physical plane, intense desire to let somebody know something, something like that, that intense desire may move the disembodied entity, the dead person, to spontaneously return to the sorrowing ones left behind. Then it may use the etheric and dense bodies of a medium to speak or write to them. So we know of these cases, some people who just cannot move on, and then they normally try to communicate with the physical plane. You know, in cases where a person died and died without being able to say something to the family or something that may be important for them, that sense of not having been able to do that may retain the person in kama loka for a long time. So in those occasions, it may be good for the person to have the possibility of just communicating with the family on the physical plane and just, you know, having some sense of closure so that the person can move on. This, in the Theosophical view, would be one of the very few examples where it is, it is useful for the soul to communicate with people while the soul is on the astral plane. Again, this is very complex. A soul that is in Devachan can communicate with our own soul, and we as a soul can bring that information to the brain. There is no problem there because we are not dragging the attention of the person to the physical plane. We are going up, let's put it this way. They are not coming down to our plane. We are going up to their plane. And that's a different situation. But when we are calling the attention back to our plane, then that is not good for people, except perhaps in an example like this that I was giving. Otherwise, it just delays the process of moving on to the heavenly state. And sometimes it generates temptation, especially with people attached to the physical world, which can have quite bad results if we stimulate in the person the attachment to the world that person has left. We'll see a little more about this. So this spontaneous return is rare in the case of persons of the type we are just now considering. So a spiritual person will not spontaneously awaken with an intense desire to communicate with the physical plane unless something special happened, like dying without being able to say something that is very important. If they are left at peace, if they are not awakened by external means, by strong emotions or by trying to get mediums or psychic people to contact them, if they are left at peace, they will gradually slip themselves quietly into Devachan, the land of bliss, and so avoid any struggle or suffering in connection with the second death. Because remember, I talked about falling again unconscious. Since consciousness was not completely awakened, this is something that happens smoothly and naturally. People who are very awake on the astral plane, just as they were afraid of physical death on the physical plane, now they are afraid of this second death on the astral plane, especially if they are, not spiritual people, if they are materialistic people. And for them, this second death is, again, a source of suffering or anxiety, with the difference that they can stay indefinitely on the astral plane. Our will can keep the astral body alive for far longer than we can on the physical body. The physical body at some point will, die. The astral body is far subtler. So if a person has a strong will to stay there, that person can stay there for centuries upon centuries. And that is very unfortunate because they are, missing the kind of life that is waiting for them in that land of bliss and the important processes that take place there where this is where the soul grows, where the soul assimilates all the experience from the previous life, where the soul has the freedom to work and deepen all the higher interests that soul had, etc. We will see all that in the next series, as I keep saying. So normally a spiritual person will not be awakened spontaneously, and the process of awakening in Devachan later is smooth and natural. Now, in the case of an average person, a man or woman, when they reach Kamaloka, the desired body possesses considerable vigor and vitality. And here, of course, there is a wide variety. We may have people in whom the desired body is very strong, and other people in whom it is strong, but not, very strong. So the experience and the time needed on the astral plane in average people will vary a lot. We are just talking generally here. So the lower manas, which is the mind that we used during incarnation, not the spiritual mind that experiences the land of bliss, the lower mind, closely interwoven with kama, desire, during the earth life just ended, having lived much in the enjoyments of objects of sense and in the pleasure of the emotions, cannot quickly disentangle itself from the web of its weaving. Remember, in the previous example, the spiritual person can go through Kamaloka in a few days, few months, a few hours if that person is very pure. But in the case of average people, that is not the case. The consciousness cannot go through the Kamaloka so quickly. Hence, a considerable delay in the world of transition in Kamaloka, while the desires wear out and fade away. So this is where the idea, the Catholic idea of purgatory comes in. For this kind of people, Kamaloka becomes a place where they have to stay until all the desires desires and emotions that were connected to the bodily experience and therefore are an obstacle to enjoy the heavenly experience. So Kamaloka is the place where all those kind of desires have to fade away, have to die away before consciousness is ready to transition to the heavenly experience. So Kamaloka is thus a kind of purgatory where we purge ourselves of all these elements that are not compatible with the spiritual, with the divine. I'm bringing in Annie Besant in this book. Death and After doesn't talk much about that aspect of the astral experience. So I'm bringing a little from another book that she wrote, Life and Life After Death, where she explains a little more of this. She says, when a man who during life has chiefly sought enjoyment for the body, so we are talking now the average person, but on the side of, a person that is quite attached to passions and desires, etc. So when this person awakens on the astral plane, and that person awakens on the astral plane because desire is strong. Remember, I said in the spiritual person, desire is not strong enough to wake consciousness up on that plane. In a person in whom desire is strong, that person will awaken on the astral plane. And when this happens, the first thing he's conscious of is that his desires, which he has so much nourished in life, are very much alive and are asking for the usual gratifications. If the man is very fond of eating and drinking or of enjoying women, these desires arise when the soul awakens after death. And though he then has a body, the astral body, the body of desire, it is a body which is quite useless so far as gratification of desire is concerned. So a person that was attached to desires that can only be satisfied when you have a physical body, then that person is on the astral plane with all the same desires. It's not that death will erase the desires. The desires are there, and now the person is there without being able to satisfy the desires. So say a person that had a habit that was attached to something physical, when we are alive, how do you get rid of a desire of that kind? By abstinence. You stop engaging in satisfying that desire, say smoking or anything else. And then you basically wait until that desire, which is not being satisfied, is starved out, let's say, and little by little fades until you get rid of the desire because you stopped feeding it. So the same needs to happen on the astral plane. The astral plane forces us to starve out all these desires because now we don't have a physical body to satisfy them. And just as it is difficult and it produces pain to people who are trying to let go of a desire on the physical plane, there is an experience of pain and sorrow on the astral plane because the person cannot satisfy the desire. The stronger the desire, the more suffering that person will endure on the astral plane while the desire is being starved out. And actually, we feel desires in the physical body. All desires come from the astral body, from the desire body. But when those desires have to translate or express themselves through the physical body is so dense and heavy compared to the other bodies that a lot of the energy of the desire is spent just in moving the heavy physical molecules in the brain or our nerves, etc., and convey that desire. So desires in the physical body are far weaker than the same desire on the astral body itself. So when a person dies, all those desires that the person had on the physical plane will be felt far more keenly, far stronger. This is why it is always intelligent to work with our desires when we are on the physical plane, where it is as difficult as that may be, it is easier than having to do it on the astral plane where we have no other option and when desires will be stronger. Now remember that we are talking here about desires that are dominant in a person. There is a level of desire that is normal in most people that is not going to exert such a strong effect on the astral plane. We are talking about people whose, as I said, the enjoyment of life is about these desires, or they have a dependence that they cannot be happy if something or the other are not there, if they cannot satisfy that desire, etc. So Besant continues, he craves for the gratifications which he has been enjoying in the physical world, and the absence of these makes him very unhappy on the other side of death. For the gratifications that he is desiring belong to this world, and on the other side of death he cannot have them. Hence, he suffers under strong sense cravings which he is unable to satisfy. So this is what I just explained. Now, Annie Besant continues in the book that we are exploring. She says, communication with Earth will generally be welcomed by this kind of disembodied person because their desires and emotions still cling to the Earth they have left, and the mind has not sufficiently lived on its own plane during life to find therein full satisfaction and contentment. So when the person doesn't have any higher satisfaction and aspirations and joys that are not connected to physical enjoyment, then after death, there is the possibility of enjoying higher things, but they don't because they never did on Earth either. So they many times seek an opportunity to communicate with Earth because we cannot go into that, but there is a possibility of the person blending his or her astral body with the astral body of somebody that is alive and feeling the same kind of emotions that the living person is feeling. So say a person that was drunk during life many times is drawn into places where people drink, and they try to have the same feelings by merging a little the two astral bodies. Now, this is very bad for both. It's very bad for the soul, and it's bad also for the person drinking. This is why it is normally recommended to people not to go to these places, because there are entities like that which are trying to have this vicarious, enjoyment. Depending on the purity of the person that is in that place, is how much that person will attract or repel these, dead people trying to have that kind of enjoyment through our own astral body. But in general, the Theosophical tradition says, try not to go to those places because normally attract these kind of people. If you go to a place where mainly there are people drinking or things like that. In any case, for the person that is drinking, that, this dead person kind of merges his astral body, what happens is that the tendencies that that person has in his astral bodies begin to strengthen the same kind of tendencies in the living person. So it's like a, contagion of certain tendencies that you didn't have, but now they are being strengthened by this kind of merging. Again, this doesn't happen immediately. This tends to happen more when there is a continuous, kind of that kind of phenomena happens continually, and then the person begins to develop unwanted habits, desires, tendencies. That is more because of this kind of contagion from the other person. So this is not a good idea. And so Besant says this communicating with the physical plane delays its further evolution, introducing an element of disharmony in what should be an orderly progression. The desired body is fed, its hold on the ego, on the soul, is maintained, and the period in Kamaloka is thus lengthened. Because remember, the idea in Kamaloka is that the desires weaken. When a person is able to do this, that person keeps feeding the astral body, and that person will never leave the Kamaloka until, the person stops feeding the desire. And all the time, this is a very unsatisfactory situation, because even though that person may feel some of the sensations and emotions of drinking, for example, it's not the same as what he or she felt while being alive. So it's a sad situation. That's why the best is just to let the desires be dissolved. We have a few more. I know our time is up, but we will finish soon. So persons who have led an evil life, let's go to the other extreme, who have gratified and stimulated their animal passions and have fully fed the desire body while they have starved even the lower mind, these remain for a long time denizens of Kamaloka and are filled with yearnings for the earth life that they have left and for the animal delights that they can no longer directly taste. These gather round the medium and the sensitive, endeavoring to utilize them for their own gratification, and these are among the more dangerous forces. So to finish, let me add something from another book by Annie Besant, Talks with a Class, where she adds a little more information. So she says, in the less evolved classes, the stay in Kamaloka is involuntary. the working out of the results of evil or the evil or passional side of their nature. So all these experiences we are talking about are experiences in the lower subplanes of Kamaloka, or of the astral plane. But there is an experience also on the higher subplanes. So she says in the higher subplanes of Kamaloka, people stay, or the stay is voluntary and depends on the will of the man himself. She says there is a case with one of those people who is always living in a library. He gets the astral counterpart of all the books that are written now, and he enjoys himself enormously. And there is no apparent reason why he should not stay there for the rest of the evolutionary cycle. He won't get out. This is a person she was trying to convince, you have to let go of this, just move on to Devachan, that is going to be even better, and you need to move on. But the person just doesn't want to. Because people who were materialistic, who were not spiritual, but had higher interests, like this person, they are awakened on the higher subplanes of the Kamaloka, which are not these places of purgation associated with suffering. These are actually, the astral plane is actually a plane that is where we are far freer than in the physical plane. We can enjoy far more than we can on the physical plane, although we enjoy far less than what we can enjoy in Devachan. So people who have not all those lower desires, but still had no spiritual aspirations, still they were attached to their personalities, they may wake up on the higher subplanes of Kamaloka, and they are not really suffering, they are having a blast in many cases. But that delays their evolution. They don't understand that even this is nothing compared to the experience in Devachan, and that they should let go of this. She gives another example. Scientific people who have clung very much to their scientific methods remain on these high subplanes of Kamaloka for a very long time. They remain just as long as they choose to remain, as long as they like that way of working. That's why she says people who are aware on the higher planes, they can extend their stay there indefinitely, because the astral body, unless we stop feeding it, will never die until the cycle of evolution is over. So she says the very idea of giving up their methods is to them so repellent that they prefer to remain in that condition, but he does not realize that he can work very much better if he himself uses his intellectual faculties in their own world, on the mental plane, in Devachan, than he can with his astral apparatus. So that's what Besant is saying. The experience is far deeper in Devachan, but these people are attached to the astral plane and they will just not move on. All right, so this is a general view. Of course, all this is very complex, but it's a general view of the different experiences that can be had on the astral plane. The ideal being just moving through it swiftly and passing on to Devachan.